Well, good morning, everyone. So this past week, we're sitting around the dinner table, and Jen is trying to explain to Macon about how before he was born, she used to work. And, now that he's in school, there was a chance that perhaps she might go back to work at some point, and she explained that a lot of mothers do this, and she just needs something to do during the day. And Macon looks her directly in the eye. He says, well, you could clean the house. I just wanted to be known for the record. I did not say a word. I have no opinion on that particular matter. That is between Jen and my son. He also looked around the house and said, look at it. No, he didn't say that. But he did have some strong opinions. Also, this past week, we had our first experience of him not going to school because of a holiday. And he says, Dad, what do we do for Labor Day? I said, nothing. You get a day off school. That is the celebration. But the funniest part was later, Jacob, who is our youth minister, his daughter is Emmy, and Emmy and Macon are close to the same age. She's a little bit older, I think. And she was telling Jacob that my son had told her that Monday was Neighbor Day. Not Labor Day, Neighbor Day. Which I think is because he doesn't pronounce his L's particularly well, and I think she substituted neighbor in there. But the more I thought about it, the more I like the idea of Neighbor Day. I think we should just invite all of our neighbors to church on Neighbor Day, That would just be a perfect way to do it. But I'll move on. So we have been in this series, we're using the gingerbread man metaphor here to talk about how a lot of times people in this world, we all look kind of the same. We fit in the same culture, and Christians are supposed to be different. Different in a good way from the things going on in the world around us. We're supposed to stand out. And we've taken that idea and we've applied it as we've read the book of Daniel. And we've done 3 weeks so far. I think in week 1, we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel deciding not to eat the king's food. And we said that sometimes to be different from others, we have to draw moral lines and then stick to them. Something that we will never do perfectly, but that in our world that makes you different, to draw lines and to be sure to follow them. In the second week, we read about, that was, what was that one? That was the dream, and Daniel has this dream, and the king needs someone to interpret it. And the only person in the whole kingdom who can interpret the dream is Daniel, but instead of taking credit for himself, he sincerely gives God the credit for interpreting the dream. And we said that one of the things that makes us different is when we sincerely give credit to God for whatever we have accomplished or anything that's going well in our lives, we see it as something that God has done and not something that we have done. And we do our best to not be in the way so that God gets the glory when we do things right. And then last week, we got into the story of the fiery furnace and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, and all they had to do was to show their loyalty to the emperor or to the empire, and they refused to do so because for them, God had to be miles above every other priority in life. Sometimes we want to make things God and our family, or God and our country, or God and this or that. But in the end, the biblical way is really God only. And that is something that is hard, but that we have to do. Now this week, we get into the next 2 chapters, in chapters 4 and chapters 5. And what I'm going to argue is that they make the same basic point. So we're going to try to read one of the stories, reflect back on the other, and figure out this fourth idea that makes us different from the world around us. And before I tell you that, I want to start out with a book. This is a book that I read in high school, It is one of the few secular books that I could say really changed my life. This is from an author by the name of C.S. Lewis. It's called Mere Christianity. It's really a collection of radio talks he gave. But in chapter 8, he opens up a talk on what he calls the great sin. And this is going to be relevant to our topic today. And I want to kind of open up just sort of reading this, and I hope you'll follow along with me, because this is something that had great impact on me as I got started in my Christian walk. I now come to that part of Christian morals where they differ most sharply from all other morals. Like, there are all these morals in the world, but this is uniquely different for Christians. There is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when they see it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. I have heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or that they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think I have ever heard anyone who is not a Christian accuse himself of this vice. And at the same time, I very seldom met anyone who was not a Christian who showed the slightest mercy to it in others. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it, the more we dislike it in others. And now the reveal. The vice I'm talking about is pride, or self-conceit. And the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals is called humility. And you may remember that when I was talking about sexual morality, I warned you that the center of Christian morals did not lie there. Well, now we have come to the center. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Does this seem to you exaggerated? If so, think it over. And today I want to spend some time thinking it over. Why is it that we are so unconscious of the sin of pride? Why is it so hard to put a finger on it, as opposed to all the other sins that we try to knock out of our lives? And what's strange is that pride can sometimes grow alongside our spirituality, as if we become proud of our faith itself. And this is a problem. And as we think about that, the fourth one is, we are different from the world when we destroy our self-pride. And that's the topic for today. But let's get back into Daniel. Let's get into Daniel. We are now to chapter 5. And we have changed to a very different time. We've actually fast-forwarded quite a few years from what we read last week. At this point, Daniel is a much older man. And no longer is Nebuchadnezzar in charge of the nation of Babylon, but it's a different man by the name of Belshazzar. Belshazzar is not even really Nebuchadnezzar's son. He's a few sons down the line. We have fast-forwarded a number of years. There are very few people left who remember the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel is just an old man somewhere. And Belshazzar, having forgotten everything that happened in those earlier days, is sort of living sort of unaware of the fact that God has anything to do with anything. And he doesn't appreciate that fact, and he sort of slips up on that fact. Another thing that we know from history is that the nation of Babylon, its empire, its power, which swept most of the known world at the time, is all but fading away. They're on the cusp of the empire ending, and it'll be dominated instead by Persia. You go from Assyria to Babylon to Persia to Alexander the Great, if you know your history. But Babylon is on the cusp of disappearing. But in the meantime, almost as if the ship were going down and no one cared, they're throwing a party. So we open up to Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1. And boy, they are really having a good time. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. This sounds like a lovely get-together. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father or forefather, ancestor, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So do you get the scene, right? This is an elaborate royal party. He is celebrating. I imagine Belshazzar, I picture him as a younger man. I don't know if that's true or not. But he's sort of got all of the best people, all of the wives and the concubines and all of the people you could want in this party. And they're drinking, they're having a good time. And just like me, Belshazzar is not a good planner. So he's like, wait a minute, we didn't buy the paper plates and the napkins and the cups. So where are we going to get these items? So they go looking through the storage, and what do they find? Why is this a big deal? Well, they come across gold and silver chalices, and their history is that they come from where? Jerusalem. So if you remember, God allowed Babylon to conquer Jerusalem and the Israelites and to even raid his temple, which is something that shocked the world at the time. The Israelites thought that the city of Jerusalem was untouchable because of their God. But because of their sin, God allowed them to go into exile, for the temple to be raided, and they hauled off all the valuable-looking things. And the valuable-looking things in the temple were the gold and silver chalices and the fancy silverware and the fine china. And I don't know if that existed back then, but you get the idea. So he decides for his party to grab all these things which God had allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take out of the temple in Jerusalem and to make them essentially party favors. And can you picture the imagery of a party likely filled with debauchery using the chalices of gold from the temple of God? You get it? This is a powerful moment. And then something really strange happens. Something that no one would have expected. There's really nothing like it anywhere else in the Bible. And it leaves them shocked. We're down to verse 5. It says, "Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote." So you imagine just this sort of floating hand, just carving into the wall some secret message. What could it mean? What does it say? What is this miracle amount? Did they drink a little too much already? But there's something there. And listen to this description. I love this description of Belshazzar. "His face turned pale. He was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking." That is exactly the way I looked on Jen and I's first date. I've seen that look before. Face pale, frightened, legs becoming weak, knees knocking. You know, this is a familiar image to me. And yet, nonetheless, we had a second date. But there's something, he is frightened, he is truly afraid. Something is going on that's unexpected. Now, what's going on, right? He typed in there, or he drew onto the wall this message. There's something mysterious, it's almost a riddle. It's really interesting. And we go on, and as sort of the pattern that you've seen, when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and he couldn't interpret it, who did he go to? Who jumped to the forefront to interpret the dream that no one else could interpret? Daniel. And so once again, we have a mystery, a riddle, a revelation from the gods, as they would think. And they need someone to interpret it. And as the pattern goes, Belshazzar calls in all of his wisest wise men, all of his most knowledgeable and trained advisors, all those who are supposed to have a way with the gods and to understand what they're presenting. And he brings them in, and every one of them fails to understand what has been written on that wall. And so they're sort of racking their brains trying to figure out, well, who else could interpret this? Who else might have some knowledge? And there's this older woman, it says queen, perhaps queen mother, someone who's been in the palace a lot longer than Belshazzar, who has a memory of someone who used to be good at this sort of thing. And the queen mother comes to Belshazzar and suggests he find a Jew by the name of Daniel. As you can imagine, Daniel comes in and he begins to say his piece. And what's funny is the first thing he does is not interpret the dream, but instead to remind him of something. That is, I've been around a little longer than you, Belshazzar. I've seen things. I'm sure you know these stories, but let me remind you of what happened to your forefather, a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. And so he begins telling him this story. At this point, we're jumping down a little bit to verse 18. He says in verse 18, "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor." Remember this. Who was the one who gave those things to Nebuchadnezzar? God, not Nebuchadnezzar, right? That's an important point in the book of Daniel. God declares who is in charge. Okay. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him, that is Nebuchadnezzar. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. And those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his, Nebuchadnezzar's heart became arrogant and hardened with, and what's that word? Pride. He was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. This brief little summary is actually a summary of the story we skipped over. If you go back to chapter 4, you can get all the details of this story. But essentially, Nebuchadnezzar, who is this powerful king who's conquered all these things, forgets that there is a God in heaven who allowed him to do those things. He fails to give him credit. And in such, he has this dream. Daniel comes, he interprets the dream. He says, "I'm sorry, it's bad news, but you're about to go insane. You're about to lose your mind, and you're going to end up just sort of walking around in the grass, eating grass like any other farm animal you can think of. And you'll be doing that for, let me check my watch, 7 years." And in fact, this is exactly what happens. We'll go back real briefly just to show you. Chapter 4 and verse 28. You see the moment. It's another kind of dramatic moment, a little bit similar to what is going on currently with Belshazzar. Chapter 4, verse 28, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later. That's after the dream and the interpretation. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" Is that the kind of thing you say before God? No, he's sitting up on the roof of his palace, looking over all that he has accomplished, and he's very proud of it. And in that moment, things go sour. Verse 31, even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven, "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You'll be driven away from the people. You will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge," what? "That the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." At the end of the 7 years, he apparently looks up to heaven, comes to his right mind, and immediately in chapter 4 is essentially a diary entry from the king of Babylon recording this event, told from the first person. And he concludes with a special thought. Verse 37. You know how the last couple chapters ended with a pagan king praising the God of the Jews? It happens one more time. "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he has done, he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to," what? Humble. Now, jumping back to our current story. Remember, Belshazzar is an ancestor of Nebuchadnezzar, just a couple down the line so that Daniel is still alive, and he tells Belshazzar, "You should have remembered that story. You should have remembered what your forefather learned, that pride destroys a person. And it's better to destroy pride before it destroys you." So chapter 5, verse 22, this is Daniel speaking. "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines drank wine from it. You praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds his life in your hands. Holds in his hand your life and all your ways. He says, you've messed up. This moment of throwing this party with these items, it just shows that you don't understand who is really in charge of things. You don't understand that the true king and the true emperor over all things is him. And you don't understand that you didn't accomplish one bit of this. It was given to you by others who got it from God. You have lost your way, Belshazzar. By the way, keep in mind, he is talking to the emperor. That's a dangerous thing to say. Now, at this point, Daniel goes on to try to explain the riddle, the thing that's written on the wall. He has to give him the interpretation. And it is an interesting and a fascinating moment. Okay. Where are we? All right, I think I've got a slide with the words on there. Let's just go there. There we go. The words on the wall are many, many tekel parsin. You know what that means. I don't have to explain this, right? No, this is actually a pretty good riddle. Even from Jewish standards and ancient standards, it's a pretty good riddle, right? So there's three different words. The first one is repeated, many, many, tekel, parson. Okay, so there are a few different ways to break it down. It's an interesting riddle, like I say. It can go in a couple different ways. Many, the first repeated, many, many, comes from, its verb form comes from numbered. And Daniel follows it up to say, your days, like on earth, are numbered, which is a pretty dramatic statement, right? And then tekel, its verb form means weighed, as you would weigh money. And he says, secondly, you have been weighed and found wanting on the grand and universal scale. And then lastly, parson in its verb form is something like divided. And he suggests from there, your kingdom will be divided and given to others. And in fact, that is what happens. Babylon is broken up. It's taken over by Persia as well as some of the Medes and the Persians. Okay. So from the verb form, it is a condemnation that says, all right, your days have been numbered, you yourself have been weighed and found wanting, and your kingdom will be taken from you and divided among others. That's the declaration. It's rather bone-chilling. There are other ways of looking at it. For instance, what is found interesting is if you go to the noun forms of these words, it could be taken a little bit differently, but with the same overall meaning. For instance, many is related to the measure. It's a monetary measure called a mina. And it is the largest measure of money that you would have on this list. Tekel is related to a shekel, which is smaller, and then divided could be interpreted, it could be half in its noun form, in which case it would be interpreted as something like, and I'm giving a modern spin to this, dollar, quarter, penny, and you're broke. You get what I'm saying? It has the same basic meaning if you interpret it that way, but it's like dollar, quarter, broke. And lastly, the word parson, I mean, you can tell even in English, it's very closely sounds like the word for Persian, and Persia is, of course, the empire's taking over him. So at least three levels, it has significance. That's a pretty good riddle. Now, here's what it's getting at, and I'll say it this way. When pride takes over your life, when you think you've got everything, watch out, because it is a depleting factor. You may start out with $1 and you may end up broke. You may start out with a kingdom and you may end up with nothing. You may start out having the time of your life and you may end up with no life at all. And that's what happens when pride takes over. And this is the bone-chilling announcement he makes to them. In fact, and I won't even bother reading it, but if you go a little bit further, you'll find out at the end of this chapter that Belshazzar is killed that very night, and the kingdom of Babylon is essentially over. So pride is the focus, both in the story of Nebuchadnezzar and in the story of Belshazzar. The question is, why? Why talk so much about pride? Why, as C.S. Lewis said, is it at the heart and center of the Christian faith? Why is it so subtle and hard to figure out? Why is it uniquely Christian in a way that nothing else really is? We all know to be good people, but very few people know not to be proud people. You see, pride, as C.S. Lewis says, is spiritual cancer. It eats away at any recognition of God is not possible because you can't see anything above you if you are looking down at everyone else. You can't accept accountability. You can't be humble enough to look into yourself, to question yourself in order to grow in your faith. You can't accept grace as something that doesn't come from what you do, but from your simple belief in an almighty God. Without humility, you can't accept the fact that you can't explain all things in this world. And without humility, you can't consider others as equals or better than you. and all your attention will by default go back to yourself. As C.S. Lewis says, pride is the complete anti-God state of mind. There is nothing that can be accomplished spiritually so long as pride still exists. Because you cannot please God when you are in it for yourself. And I don't think that Christians understand this enough. For me, when I was coming up through school, and I don't know if this was you guys, we didn't always go to church. We kind of started going to church. And prior to really getting involved and learning on my own, I always thought that Christianity was just a matter of, let's just be a good person and you're good, I thought, okay, well, that's good because I'm a good person. I come from a good family. I don't get in much trouble. I don't go to the big parties because I'm not invited. I'm a good kid, right? But somewhere along the way, I realized that very assumption comes from pride. It makes you think that you're better than you are. It makes you think that you must be good with God because compared to all these people you see around you, you're just glowing, It makes you think you've got it made. When you realize, though, that God doesn't give you credit for every time you make an A on a test and every time you don't tell off the teacher, you realize that God actually wants something more from you. And it's not to be a good person per se. It's to have a relationship with Him that makes you constantly become a humbler person who trusts in Him more and more and more. And so pride is this spiritual cancer. It's an anti-God state of mind. And when it mixes with religion, it is the absolute pinnacle of evil. When we use our religion to become proud, we end up just like the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, who held on to their places and positions, even while the Son of God Himself criticized them for it. Pride is the complete anti-God state of mind. And what C.S. Lewis didn't go far enough to say, at least in that chapter, and what I'd like to add on is my own little, not because I'm nearly as good as C.S. Lewis, keep that in mind. But if pride is the anti-God state of mind, then you need to know that the gospel is the anti-pride state of mind. You can't be with God and have pride, and you cannot understand the gospel if you've still got pride. You can't hold on to it, because the gospel is all about losing our pride and destroying it till we understand that God is everything, that we are not saved by our works, that we are not as good a people as we think, that we can't even fulfill our own conscience, let alone the expectations of a God who is bigger than all of us and rules all the world. With the gospel, we don't take credit for our salvation. We are called instead to empty ourselves toward others. You cannot have pride and confess your sins. You cannot have pride and accept an authority above you. You cannot have pride and be accountable to something more important than you. You cannot have pride and live for other people and other things. You cannot have pride and take credit for your salvation. You cannot have pride and empty yourself for other people. In other words, the gospel calls us to be like Jesus, who emptied himself of the treasures of heaven to die on a cross for ordinary people like you and me. And it's amazing that he loved us so much. He does not love me more than you or you more than me. He loves every one of us. And for some reason, he felt it was more important to save us than to stay in heaven and be God eternal. Jesus emptied himself. And we cannot continue to live in pride and really be followers of the God who destroys pride. By following the gospel and destroying our pride, we are made unlike any other people on earth. It is distinctly Christian. It is recognizable from the moment you meet that person. This person is not playing a game of trying to get ahead of everyone else. He's not worried about what everyone thinks about everything he does and how he's dressed. And obviously, I do not care how I dress. Otherwise, I would be wearing something different. Someone like that just enjoys life, isn't looking for the credit. And you feel different around them because they actually, truly, genuinely care about you. Because they weren't thinking about themselves to begin with. People who figure this out aren't running the rat race of life, filled with constant anxiety, constantly depressed about where they fit into the grand scheme, because they know where they fit. They know they are God's people chosen to serve and bless others. And that's enough. I want to do one more thing before we kind of move on from this. Because this is something that comes from my particular conversations with different people, my own experience myself. When we come to pride, the tendency is sometimes to beat ourselves up, right? The way that I battle pride is I tell myself I'm no good, I'm not worth anything, this or that. Well, that is definitely not in the Bible either, right? I mean, according to the Bible, you are valuable enough that the God of the universe sent his Son to die on the cross in a singular moment in history just so that you and all these other people with you could be with him. That's not valuable. The problem is we have this tendency, and I've got a little chart here. It may or may not make sense to you, but it's my best explanation of what I see. I figure, in my experience and even in myself, that people have a very hard time figuring out how to think about themselves. And so we have this problem. And I'm calling it, at least for today, the cycle of self-pity. That is, on one hand, we have this continuum. We either hate ourselves or we love ourselves, and we constantly vacillate between the two. Does this sound familiar to you? One day, you just absolutely loathe yourself and how you can't get anything right and, all this stuff, and I can't believe I'm so bad at this. I don't know why anyone thinks anything of me at all, and you're sort of in this cycle of bad thoughts. You're just hating yourself one day, and the next day, you're like, no, I don't need to be like that. There's this one thing I'm really good at, and then you jump over to, no, I need to love myself, and you sort of vacillate all the way over to the other end really quick. And then someone comes along, and that one thing that you thought you were good at that was holding up and propping up your self-pride, turns out there's someone or lots of people who are better at it than you. And then what happens? All the way to the other side again. And then you go and you hate yourself again for a while and say, no, I can't live like this. And then you find something to like about yourself, and you're over here again. And then you vacillate all up and down and everywhere in between over and over and over again in this cycle of self-pity and, honestly, self-focus. Does any of that sound familiar to anyone? This is my mental life. I'll just tell you, okay? This is what I have dealt with in my at different times in my life. But we do this vacillating thing because our self-pride is there, but it's built on very rickety things. And so it falls down, it gets rebuilt over and over again. And here's the problem. The problem is, whether you're on one side or the other, who are you thinking about the entire time? You can answer. You. That's the problem. It may not be pride exactly, but it's certainly self-focus. And you spend all your time trying to figure out, well, how do I fit into all this? Am I a good person or a bad person? Am I talented? Am I successful? Am I viewed as successful? When I walk into this room, are people staring at me thinking, well, why are you dressed that way? And did you have a little too much to eat last night? And, you walk into this room and everyone must be staring at you. And where do I fit in this? And how do they see me? And am I okay or not? How do I measure up, if you will? And when your mind is constantly concerned with how you measure up and where you fit in and what other people are thinking, the natural result is anxiety, depression, jealousy, envy, combativeness, and just general unhappiness. I mean, how could you be happy? You're jumping from one end to the other all the time. And then you come back to the Bible. And instead of propping yourself up on these things you're good at or what you're talented at or, how tall you are, like I do, instead you prop yourself up on truth from the Bible. Things like, okay, the God of the universe thought I was valuable enough to send his son to die on the cross for me. The God of the universe has used people of all different abilities, ages, and knowledge sets to advance his kingdom all throughout Scripture. The God of the universe, when he called me into this, already took into account all of my weaknesses, and in fact works best within my weaknesses. The God of the universe may not value me above others, but he values me just as much as everyone else. And the entire thing he's calling me toward is to stop thinking about myself so much and to become aware of what is outside of me, to the point where I do not think less of myself, but I think of myself less. And when we do that, we can break the cycle of self-pity, because we stopped focusing all of our attention on me. The gospel has a lot to say to this cycle. It wants to prop you up with eternal things that cannot be taken away. The love of God, the intricacies of creation, and the joy of life. The certainty of salvation for those who believe. Those things will never be lost. They are for you to have and hold eternally. Nothing could happen in this world that would knock over that foundation. You are you because those things are true, and it can never change. And when you are at peace with that, when that is your sole identity, you are free to think about something else. Praise God. I was getting sick of that game anyway. You understand? So today, what makes us different from others is when we get out of this game, we make our identity on Christ, we find peace, and we destroy pride. If you ever met someone like that, who really, really figured it out, they would stand out because they'd be unlike anything else in this world. I'm still working on it. I hope you are too. A couple application points, and we'll move on. One thing, I want you to recall a time that pride has led you to make a bad decision or make a mistake. Have any of you ever, in your pride, done anything you shouldn't have done that was kind of silly? This isn't quite the right one, but I was trying to think of a story real quick. But I do remember one time being at church camp, mind you. There were pretty girls at church camp, and I wanted to show off. And I said, why are you looking around, Jennifer? At your kids, okay. And there was this ledge up there, right? And I was like, well, you know what? I was in my wrestling shape back then. I was going to jump up there and do some pull-ups and show off for everybody. And that ledge, which I thought was really, flat and would be easy to grab onto, turns out that there was nothing under here. It was just hollow, and one really sharp piece of metal was all that it was. I reached up there, I grabbed that, tore all the skin off my hand. It was a lovely day, and I'm sure I impressed no girls in that moment. Pride will make you do dumb things. I want you to just recall a time in life where pride caused you to make a mistake. And remember that while that is silly, sometimes it makes worse mistakes. Number two, I want you to try to stop that cycle of self-pity that we talked about by thinking about yourself less. And I know that's hard, and that's a whole lifestyle change, and it will take weeks and months to maybe get any traction on it. but it does require controlling your thoughts, stopping yourself from going down rehearsed roads that you've done 1,000 times, and instead think about something else. In particular, I'd suggest thinking about truths in the Bible and how that gives you an identity besides. And lastly, number 3, I want you to focus, like that, on the truths of who God made you to be and what Scripture says about you. These are the things that give us an unshakable foundation, and they will prop up a sense of being pleased or joyful without being proud. And I know that's a hard thing, but that is what every one of us needs. And I want you to focus instead of all the other things that lead us into self-pity or pride to instead think about what God has done and who He made us to be. I know it's weird that self-hatred and self-pride are they're so close, they're almost indistinguishable at times. But that is the nature of the game. They're honestly two sides of the same coin. It's being insecure that's at the heart of both of them. It just really is. So, this week we're focusing on being different by destroying our pride. I hope that was helpful to you. We covered 2 chapters. We'll finish up next week in Daniel chapter 6. I hope you'll be here, and I hope we'll have a great time looking a little bit deeper into the book of Daniel. If you will, let's close with a word of prayer. God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for giving us a foundation and identity that is beyond this world. There are so many things that we can lose, but your love for us is something we will never lose. And when that becomes our everything, then there is nothing else we lack. God, teach us to push down our pride, to not think that everything that goes well is our accomplishment and not everything that goes bad is our failure. Because, Lord, sometimes life just happens. But rather than put us out here on our own and expect us to figure it out, you decided to come along with us on the journey. So let us turn to you with every step that you guided and lead us. Lord, help us to be different from the world around us by stepping out of this rat race and simply loving the God who loves us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.